The fire came without warning, but that's not what nearly killed him. Caleb Ridge had survived 20 winters alone in these mountains. He'd outlasted drought, hunger, and the kind of silence that makes a man forget his own voice. But when an old woman knocked on his door asking for work, he let her in. 1 week, he told himself, just 1 week. He didn't know that decision would cost him everything he'd built to protect himself. This is a story about the things we save and the things that save us back. If you're watching from somewhere far from these mountains, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you what really happened in that valley. The August sun hammered the valley like a blacksmith working iron, and Caleb Ridge moved through it with the mechanical precision of a man who'd long ago stopped expecting anything to change. His boots crunched against the baked earth of his sorry excuse for a garden, if you could even call it that anymore. The tomato plants had surrendered weeks ago, their leaves curled and brown, their promised fruit shriveled to nothing before it ever had a chance to blush red. The beans hadn't even bothered to climb their stakes. Everything here knew the same truth Caleb did. This land took more than it gave, and only the stubborn or the stupid kept trying. He was both. The cabin stood behind him, a structure of weathered pine and peeling tar paper that had seen better decades. Its single window faced east, catching the morning light for exactly 90 minutes before the shadow of Widow's Peak swallowed it whole for the rest of the day. Caleb had built that cabin himself 17 years back, when he'd first fled to these mountains with nothing but a pack, a rifle, and a determination to disappear so completely that even memory couldn't find him. He'd succeeded. Sometimes he went 3 weeks without seeing another human face, the way he liked it. A hawk circled high above, riding thermals that Caleb couldn't feel down here in the breathless heat. He watched it for a moment, envying its perspective, its freedom from the weight of footsteps and decisions. Then he bent back to his work, wrestling with the pump that supplied his water. The leather gasket had split again, and he was down to his last spare. Everything was always running out. He was elbow deep in the pump housing when he heard it, the distant sound of boots on the trail. Not the heavy tread of ranch hands heading up to the summer pastures, but something slower, more deliberate, measured. Caleb froze, his hands still on the wrench. Visitors were rare. Visitors on foot were rarer still. The nearest town was 11 miles down a trail that most horses handled with complaint. Anyone walking it in this heat was either desperate or deranged, and Caleb had no use for either variety. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, and waited. The mountains had taught him patience, if nothing else. Whatever was coming would arrive in its own time. The figure appeared where the trail crested the ridge, silhouetted against the brutal white sky. Small frame, careful steps. A woman, Caleb realized. Elderly, from the way she moved. She carried a canvas pack that looked like it might weigh as much as she did, and she stopped at the top of the rise to catch her breath before continuing down toward his cabin. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before, years ago, when Widow Jameson had tried to sell him handmade quilts she could barely carry. Desperation wore a lot of faces, but they all had the same eyes. He considered going inside, pretending he hadn't seen her, let her knock on an empty cabin and figure it out. But something in the way she walked, proud, despite the obvious exhaustion, made him stay put. Pride was something he understood. She took her time crossing the yard, and Caleb used those minutes to study her. Late 60s, maybe older. Gray hair pulled back in a braid that had started the day neat, but had surrendered to the heat and the hike. Her dress was simple, practical, the kind ranch women wore, designed for work rather than show. Her face was weathered like good leather, lined but not fragile, and her hands, even from this distance, looked strong. She stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to respect the obvious boundaries of a man who lived alone on purpose. "Mr. Ridge?" Her voice was steady, though he could hear the dryness in it. She'd need water soon. That's right. He didn't ask how she knew his name. Everyone for 50 miles knew about the hermit in the high valley, even if they'd never seen him. "You're a ways from anywhere." "I am." She set her pack down carefully, and he noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she did. Not weakness, fatigue. "My name is Evelyn Harper. Until 3 days ago, I cooked at the Running Creek Ranch." Until 3 days ago. Until Bill Carver decided 67 was too old to be useful. She said it without bitterness, just fact. Hired his nephew's wife instead. Younger hands, he said. Steadier. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something cold turned over in his chest. He knew Bill Carver. Knew the type, anyway. Men who measured worth in horsepower and work speed, who traded people like equipment when they started to slow down. That's a rough deal, he said, because something had to be said. It's the deal that's given. Evelyn met his eyes, and he saw no plea in them, no performance of helplessness. Just a woman stating terms. I've got $32 to my name, nowhere to go, and no interest in charity. I can cook, clean, mend, garden if the soil's willing. I'll work for room and board and whatever you think is fair beyond that. Caleb stared at her. Of all the things he'd expected, this wasn't it. Ma'am, I don't need... Everyone needs something. She cut him off gently but firmly. You're living on canned beans and jerky, if you're eating at all. That garden's dead because nobody's been paying it proper attention. Your shirt's missing 2 buttons, and that tear in your jeans has been there so long you don't even notice it anymore. He glanced down involuntarily. She was right about all of it. And your roof, she continued, tilting her head slightly, has a leak on the north side that you've been ignoring. I can see the water stain from here. Caleb felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the sun. I manage fine. I'm sure you do. No mockery in her tone, just acknowledgement. But fine isn't the same as good, and survival isn't the same as living. I'm not asking you to save me, Mr. Ridge. I'm offering you a fair trade. He wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at him to send her away, to protect the careful solitude he'd built. Letting someone into this space meant noise, meant questions, meant the possibility of disappointment on both sides when it inevitably didn't work out. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, the calm determination in her voice that caught him. She wasn't begging, she was negotiating, and damn if he didn't respect that. 1 week, he heard himself say, trial basis. You don't like it, you're free to go. I don't like it, same deal. You sleep in the loft, keep to yourself otherwise. We'll figure out meals and such as we go. For the first time, something that might have been relief flickered across her face. Not joy, she was too tired for that, but relief. That's more than fair, thank you. Don't thank me yet. He nodded toward the cabin. It's not much. Neither am I anymore. She picked up her pack, and he noticed again how her hands shook with the weight. He almost offered to carry it, then stopped himself. She had her pride. He wouldn't take that from her on the first day. The cabin was exactly what he'd warned. Not much. 1 room with a loft accessible by a ladder, a wood stove that worked better for heat than cooking, a table he'd made himself from green wood that had warped so badly it rocked with every use, a single chair, a cot in the corner with blankets that had seen too many winters, shelves holding canned goods, tools, a few books he'd read so many times he could recite passages from memory. Evelyn surveyed it all with the same calm assessment she'd given the yard. The loft will do fine, she said. I'll need some rags and a bucket if you have them, and I'll want to look at that stove before I start any cooking. I don't expect... Mr. Ridge. She set her pack down with a definitive thump. We have an agreement. I'll be holding up my end. I'd appreciate if you'd let me do it my way. He almost smiled. Almost. Buckets out back. Rags in the chest by the stove. She nodded and set to work immediately, climbing the ladder to inspect the loft with a careful efficiency that spoke of decades doing exactly this kind of assessment. Caleb watched for a moment, feeling suddenly like an intruder in his own space, then retreated outside to finish with the pump. But he couldn't focus. His hands moved through the familiar motions, but his mind was stuck on the woman in his cabin, rearranging the careful isolation he'd maintained for so long. 1 week, he reminded himself. 7 days, and she'd probably realize this was a mistake. The loneliness up here wasn't the peaceful kind people imagined. It was heavy and thick, and it pressed on you until you either broke or learned to become small enough that it couldn't find you anymore. Caleb had learned to become very small indeed. He was testing the pump, water flowing clear and cold finally, when he heard the sound from inside the cabin. For a moment he couldn't place it. It had been so long. Then he recognized it. Humming. Nothing he recognized, just a soft habitual melody that spoke of muscle memory older than thought. The sound of someone working with their hands, filling silence not because it needed filling, but because it felt natural to do so. Caleb shut off the pump and stood very still, listening. It had been 17 years since there had been music of any kind in this valley. 17 years since anything had suggested that life was meant for more than mere endurance. He didn't know yet if that sound was a gift or a threat. The first meal Evelyn cooked was nothing fancy. Beans and cornbread, same staples Caleb had been living on. But somehow it tasted different. The beans had depth, flavored with some kind of herb he didn't recognize. The cornbread was moist instead of crumbling into dry powder. She'd found his pathetic jar of honey and drizzled it on top, and Caleb ate 3 pieces before he realized he was doing it. They ate in silence, Evelyn at the table, Caleb standing by the stove because there was only one chair, and he'd be damned if he'd take it from an elderly woman. She didn't comment on the arrangement, just ate with the steady focus of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste food or energy. "You don't talk much," she observed when she'd finished, setting her plate aside with a tidiness that made Caleb aware of his own scattered habits. "No. That's fine. Some people run their mouths to avoid thinking. You strike me as someone who thinks plenty." He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an accusation. "I manage." There's that word again. She stood gathering the plates. Managing, surviving, getting by. Curious how many words we have for barely. Caleb felt his shoulders tense. "I didn't ask for a philosophy lesson." "No, you asked for someone to cook and clean. That's what I'm doing." She moved to the basin, filling it with water from the bucket. "Everything else is just conversation. You don't have to participate." He wanted to argue, but couldn't find the foothold. She was right. She was doing exactly what he'd agreed to, nothing more. If he found her observations uncomfortable, that was his problem, not hers. "I'm going to check the perimeter fence," he said instead, grabbing his hat from its peg. "Won't be back until dark." "I'll leave you something on the stove." He left without answering, stepping out into the cooling evening air. The sun was starting its descent behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. This was usually his favorite time of day, the heat breaking, the world settling into the quiet rhythms of dusk. But tonight the quiet felt different. Tonight he knew that when he returned, there would be light in the window. There would be the smell of something cooking. There would be another person's presence rearranging the careful emptiness he'd cultivated. 1 week, he told himself again. 7 days. He could survive 7 days of anything. The ranch hands showed up on day 3, 2 of them on horseback, young and cocky in the way of men who'd never had their confidence properly tested. Caleb was splitting wood when they rode up, and he knew from their grins that they hadn't come for any good reason. "Caleb Ridge," the taller one called out, sitting easy in his saddle. "Heard you got yourself some help up here." Caleb buried the axe in the stump and straightened. He knew these 2, worked for Bill Carver at Running Creek, the same Bill Carver who'd fired Evelyn for being too old. The irony wasn't lost on him. News travels fast. Small county, not much happens worth talking about. The writer's grin widened. Except when the crazy mountain hermit hires Bill's old cook. That's worth a few words. She needed work. I needed help. That's all there is to it. The second rider, shorter and meaner looking, leaned forward in his saddle. That old woman couldn't help a fly out of a jar. Bill did you a favor, taking her off the market. She was about to fall apart just cooking eggs. Caleb felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. She's doing fine. For now. The tall one shrugged. But what happens when she breaks a hip climbing that ladder? Or her hands get too shaky to hold a knife? You thought about that? What I've thought about is that it's none of your business. Just looking out for you, Ridge, that's all. But the grin said otherwise. Folks are talking is all, saying maybe you're not as tough as you make out if you need an old grandmother to keep house for you. The shorter one snickered. Maybe he likes having someone to tuck him in at night. Caleb took 2 steps forward before he caught himself. The riders tensed, hands moving toward their belts, though whether for weapons or just show, he couldn't tell. The moment stretched tight as wire. Then Evelyn's voice came from the cabin doorway, calm as Sunday morning. "Gentlemen, if you're staying for lunch, I should know now. Otherwise, Mr. Ridge has work to finish and you're casting shadows on it." All three men turned to look at her. She stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, her expression pleasantly neutral. Nothing in her posture suggested she'd heard the insults or cared if she had. The tall rider's grin faltered. "No, ma'am, we were just leaving." "Safe travels, then." She went back inside without waiting for a response, and Caleb heard the gentle clatter of dishes resuming. The riders exchanged glances, their sport ruined by her complete refusal to be bothered by it. "You take care, Ridge," the tall one said, gathering his reins. "Old folks are fragile. Hate to see anything happen." They rode off laughing, but the sound was forced, the joke already deflating in the face of Evelyn's indifference. Caleb stood watching them go, his hands still clenched, his heart still hammering with an anger that had nowhere useful to go. When he finally turned back to the woodpile, he found Evelyn had returned to the doorway, this time with a cup of water. "You didn't have to," he started. "Didn't have to what? Offer lunch to strangers? That's just manners." She held out the water. "You look like you could use this." He took it, drank it in 3 long swallows. They were out of line. "They were bored boys playing at being men. I've seen 1,000 of them." She took the empty cup back. "And I've outlasted every single one. They're saying things. About you. About this. Let them say. Words are cheap, and the people who spend them freely usually don't have much else of value to offer." She met his eyes, and he saw no hurt there, no shame, just a calm certainty that made his anger feel childish by comparison. "You gonna let their small opinions make you smaller?" He wanted to argue, to defend his reaction, but she'd already gone back inside, the conversation clearly over in her mind. Caleb stood alone in the yard, holding an empty cup, feeling like he'd somehow lost an argument he hadn't known he was having. That night, after another meal that tasted of care he didn't know how to name, he lay awake in his cot and listened to the soft sounds of Evelyn settling into the loft above him. He heard the creak of old joints, the rustle of blankets, the small sighs of a body finding rest after a long day. And he thought about what those ranch hands had said. Not the insults, those he could dismiss, but the underlying truth they'd weaponized. Evelyn was old. She was slowing down. Her hands did shake sometimes, though she tried to hide it. She climbed that ladder more carefully each day. She was by every practical measure exactly what Bill Carver had said. Too old to be useful. Except she'd cooked 3 meals today that Caleb would have struggled to make in a week. She'd mended the tear in his jeans so neatly he couldn't find the seam. She'd organized his disastrous shelves into something resembling sense. She'd filled the water buckets, fed the chickens he'd been half-heartedly maintaining, and somehow made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a place someone might actually want to be. Too old to be useful. The words sat in his chest like stones. Caleb had spent 17 years in these mountains, running from the world's judgments, from its constant measuring and weighing of worth. He'd thought himself free of all that up here, but listening to those ranch hands, he'd heard the same cruel mathematics he'd fled from, the reduction of human value to productivity, to strength, to the ability to serve someone else's needs without complaint or faltering. And he'd seen, for just a moment, how easily he could become what they were mocking, how close he already was to being the thing people discarded when it stopped being convenient. Above him, Evelyn's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Tomorrow she would wake before him, as she had every morning, and begin the small rituals that were somehow transforming this place. She would hum while she worked. She would say things that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite name. She would be steady and capable and dignified, and she would do it all with hands that shook just a little more each day. 1 week, he'd told her. 4 days had passed. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to remember what the cabin had felt like before she arrived. The memory was already getting fuzzy at the edges, which bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He'd built this solitude carefully, stone by stone, and here was one old woman dismantling it with nothing more than cornbread and quiet competence. The worst part was, he wasn't sure he wanted her to stop. On day 5, the well went dry. Caleb discovered it at dawn when he lowered the bucket and it came up with nothing but a handful of mud and disappointment. He stood staring at it for a long moment, trying to calculate just how completely this complicated everything. The spring-fed creek was half a mile down the valley. In winter, that was nothing. In August, with the sun hammering down and only 2 water buckets to work with, it might as well have been on the moon. They'd need to make multiple trips a day just to keep up with basic needs. He was still standing there, contemplating his options, when Evelyn emerged from the cabin with her usual morning efficiency. "Well's dry," he said, because there was no point in softening it. She nodded, unsurprised. "Figured it might be soon. Ground's been cracking all week." She surveyed the situation with the same calm assessment she brought to everything. "How far to the nearest water?" "Half-mile. Rocky trail." "Then we'd better get started." She ducked back into the cabin and emerged with both buckets, already moving toward the path before Caleb could formulate a protest. "Ma'am, I can handle—" "Mr. Ridge." She turned to face him, buckets in hand. "I am 67 years old, not 67 years dead. I've been hauling water since before you were born. I'll thank you not to treat me like I'm made of spun glass." "I wasn't—" "You were about to suggest you do all the hauling while I sit on the porch like decorative furniture. I can see it on your face, plain as day." She softened slightly, reading something in his expression. "I know you mean well, but there's a difference between helping someone and helping yourself feel useful by making them helpless. I need to work. Not for you. For me. Understand?" He did, though it sat uncomfortably. "The trail's rough." "Then we'll go slow." She started walking, and after a moment, Caleb grabbed his own buckets and followed. The trip down was easier than the climb back up, but easier was relative. The trail was steep in places, loose with scree, and the heat was already building despite the early hour. Evelyn set a measured pace, stopping when she needed to without apology or explanation. Caleb found himself matching her rhythm, something he rarely did with anyone. At the creek, they filled the buckets in silence. The water ran clear and cold, and Caleb allowed himself a long drink before they started back. Evelyn did the same, then splashed some on her face and neck, the simple pleasure of it evident in her expression. "Used to be a creek like this near where I grew up," she said, more to the water than to him. "Smaller, but just as cold. My brothers and I would spend whole summers in it, coming home when we got hungry enough to remember we had a mother who'd feed us." It was the first personal thing she'd volunteered, and Caleb didn't know what to do with it. "That sounds nice." It was, until it wasn't. She straightened, reaching for her buckets. The mining company came through, diverted it for their equipment. Dried it up in a single season. We moved away the next year. "That's rough." "It's what happened." She started back up the trail, her breathing already labored from the weight. "Everything ends, Mr. Ridge. The trick is not to be bitter about it when it does." They made 4 trips that day. By the third, Caleb could see the strain on Evelyn, the tremor in her hands more pronounced, her steps less certain. But she never complained, never asked for help carrying the weight. Just kept that same steady pace, adjusting when she needed to, resting when the trail demanded it. On the 4th trip, as the sun was starting its descent, she stumbled. It wasn't dramatic, just a moment where her foot didn't land where she expected, where the weight of the buckets pulled her off balance. Caleb's hand shot out instinctively, steadying her elbow, and for a moment they both froze. "Thank you," she said quietly. He let go as soon as she had her footing, but something had shifted. Some unspoken acknowledgement of limits, of the reality those ranch hands had thrown in his face. That night, Evelyn went to bed without eating her full portion. She claimed she wasn't hungry, but Caleb saw the exhaustion in every line of her body. Heard it in the way she climbed that ladder, slower, more careful, with pauses she tried to hide. He lay awake again, listening to her breathe above him, and thought about water and time and the way everything runs dry eventually. The week was nearly over when the storm rolled in. Caleb saw it coming from miles away, a dark wall of cloud marching over the western peaks like an invading army. Rain was rare enough in August, but this looked like something more violent. Thunder already rumbled in the distance, and the air had taken on that electric quality that made his skin prickle. "We need to secure everything," he told Evelyn, who was hanging laundry that would need to come down immediately. "This is going to be bad." They worked together in the growing wind, moving through the practiced choreography of storm preparation. Tools inside, animals in the lean-to, windows shuttered. Evelyn moved with quiet efficiency, asking questions only when necessary, following his lead with the same trust she brought to everything else. The first drops hit as they were finishing, fat and heavy, striking the dust like bullets. Then the sky opened up. Caleb couldn't remember the last time he'd seen rain like this. It came in sheets, turning the world gray and roaring, overwhelming the carefully maintained silence of the valley with its violence. Lightning split the sky, thunder following seconds later, close enough to feel in his chest. Inside the cabin, they stood by the window watching it come down. The roof leaked exactly where Evelyn had predicted, and she'd already positioned a bucket to catch it. The drumming of rain on the roof was almost deafening, but somehow comforting too, a reminder that the world was bigger than the small circle of their daily routines. "How long will it last?" Evelyn asked, raising her voice to be heard. "No telling. Could be an hour, could be all night." He watched the creek beginning to swell, carrying debris from higher up the mountain. "We're safe here, though, built on high ground." She nodded, and for a moment they just stood there, two people watching the storm together, held in the strange intimacy of shared shelter. When the lightning struck the pine tree at the edge of the clearing, they both flinched. The crack was enormous, instantaneous, and the tree split down the middle, one half falling toward the lean-to where Caleb's chickens and his old mule were sheltering. He was moving before he'd fully processed it, grabbing his coat and hat, heading for the door. Evelyn's hand caught his arm. "That's madness. You'll be killed. The animals are already dead or already safe. You running out into lightning won't change which." Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Wait. Just wait until it passes the worst." Every instinct screamed at him to go, to do something, to not just stand here while things he was responsible for were potentially dying. But Evelyn's hand on his arm, her calm certainty, held him in place. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the hardest thing is knowing you can't fix it." They stood in the doorway and watched the storm rage. The fallen tree had missed the lean-to by inches. Caleb could see that now, could see the mule's white face peering out, frightened but unharmed. Relief made him weak. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it finally passed, it left the valley transformed, green where it had been brown, alive where it had been dormant. The garden Caleb had given up for dead was drinking deep, and he could already imagine how it might recover. The creek ran high and fast, carrying the gift of water that would refill his well, that would sustain them through whatever came next. And Evelyn stood beside him in the doorway, her hand still resting lightly on his arm, both of them breathing hard like they'd run a race together. "Thank you," Caleb said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. For stopping him, maybe. Or for staying. Or for being there in the first place, disrupting his careful isolation with her quiet presence and her stubborn dignity and her refusal to be what the world had decided she should be. "You're welcome," she said, and her hand slipped away, leaving him feeling strangely unmoored. That night, after a meal of beans and cornbread that somehow tasted better after the storm, after Evelyn had climbed the ladder to the loft with her careful, measured movements, Caleb lay awake and thought about time. 7 days had passed. The trial week was over, and he had no idea how to tell her that he wanted her to stay. Morning came soft and clean, the valley washed new by the storm. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the weak chicory blend he'd been stretching, and sat up to find Evelyn already at the stove. "Thought we might celebrate," she said without turning around. "End of the week and all." So she'd been counting too. Caleb pulled on his boots, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was young. "About that," he started. "I'll be packed by noon," she said, still not looking at him. "I appreciate the week, Mr. Ridge. Truly. It's given me time to figure out my next steps." "That's not... you don't have to..." The words tangled on his tongue, years of disuse making him clumsy. "If you wanted to stay. Longer. Permanently, even. That would be... I'd be fine with that." She turned then, and he saw something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not quite surprised, she was too composed for that. But something softer, more vulnerable. "You're certain?" she asked. "This isn't charity? This is me being selfish," he said honestly. "This week, the cabin's been..." He struggled for the right word. "Better. You make it better. The food, yes, but not just that. The way you hum while you work. The way you don't feel silence just because it's there. The way you look at things, at me, like there might be more there than what's on the surface." Her eyes shone, though no tears fell. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in longer than I can remember. It's just the truth." "Truth's not just anything, Mr. Ridge. Truth's the hardest thing there is to say and the rarest thing there is to hear." She came closer, and he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, all the marks of time she wore without apology. "I'd be honored to stay, on one condition." "Name it." "You stop calling me ma'am. My name is Evelyn." He almost smiled. Almost. "Caleb." "I know, but thank you for offering it proper." She poured 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. 2 new arrangements. They stood in the morning light, drinking coffee that tasted like celebration, while outside the valley bloomed with impossible green. The week was over, and something new was beginning, something neither of them had names for yet, something that scared Caleb more than any storm or solitude ever had. But Evelyn was humming again, that soft, unconscious melody, and somehow that made it easier, made it possible to imagine that this cabin might become more than a shelter, that these mountains might hold something other than isolation, that an old woman and a broken man might find, in each other's quiet company, a reason to build rather than simply endure. The fire that would test them was already burning somewhere to the west, fed by lightning strikes and dry timber, growing with a hunger that would soon turn the sky orange and fill the valley with smoke. But that was still weeks away, and this morning was clean and new, and Evelyn was staying. For now, that was enough. Caleb took another sip of coffee and watched the sun climb over the eastern ridge, warming a world that suddenly felt less empty than it had the day before. 1 week had become permanent, and he was surprised to find that the thought didn't terrify him the way it should have. Maybe he was changing. Or maybe Evelyn had been right all along. Maybe survival wasn't the same as living, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning the difference. The mountains stood eternal around them, indifferent witnesses to small human moments. But in that cabin, in that valley, on that morning after the storm, something had shifted. Something had begun. And Caleb Ridge, who had spent 17 years learning to be alone, was discovering that he might not be very good at it after all. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Caleb with its ease. Evelyn moved through the cabin like water finding its level, never forcing, never demanding, simply being present in ways that gradually reshaped the space. She rose before dawn each morning, and Caleb would wake to the sound of the stove being lit, the gentle clatter of the coffee pot, the soft humming that had become as much a part of the morning as birdsong. He found himself rising earlier too, not because he had to, but because those quiet moments before full daylight, when they moved around each other in the dimness, sharing coffee in silence, had become something he looked forward to more than he wanted to admit. The garden responded to her attention the way everything seemed to. Within 2 weeks, the tomato plants that Caleb had written off as dead began showing new growth. The beans climbed their stakes with renewed determination. She'd planted herbs he'd never heard of in the spaces between, and the smell of them in the morning dew made the whole valley feel different somehow, more alive. "It's all about consistency," she explained one morning, showing him how to pinch back the tomato suckers. "Plants are like people. They can survive neglect, but they thrive on steady care." Caleb watched her weathered hands work, noting how the tremor was less pronounced when she was focused on something. "I never had the patience for it." "You had the patience, you just didn't have the hope." She glanced up at him, her expression gentle but unflinching. Hard to tend something when you don't believe it'll amount to anything. He couldn't argue with that. For years, everything he'd planted had been an experiment in futility, something to pass the time while waiting for the next winter, the next challenge, the next proof that this land would take more than it gave. He'd approached the garden the same way he'd approached everything, as something to survive rather than cultivate. "Well," he said, straightening up and wiping dirt from his hands, "you've got hope enough for both of us, seems like." "Hope's not something you have, Caleb. It's something you practice." She moved down the row, her skirt dragging slightly in the dirt, leaving a trail he could follow. "Every day you choose to believe tomorrow might be better, you're practicing hope. Gets easier the more you do it." He thought about that as he went about his other chores, checking the fence line, splitting wood for the coming winter, maintaining the tools that kept this small operation running. Hope, as practice, not feeling. That made a strange kind of sense to him. He'd spent so long thinking hope was for people who hadn't yet learned how hard the world was. But maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe it was for people who'd learned exactly how hard it was and chose to plant gardens anyway. The cabin itself transformed under her steady attention. She attacked the accumulated grime of 17 years with the same patient determination she brought to everything, working in sections so she wouldn't overwhelm herself. First the shelves, organizing his chaotic collection of canned goods and supplies into something approaching sense. Then the floors, scrubbing until the old pine showed its grain again. The windows, the walls, the corners where dust and resignation had gathered in equal measure. Caleb watched it happen with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Each improvement felt like an indictment of how he'd been living, proof that he'd let things slide so far past acceptable that he'd stopped seeing it. But Evelyn never made him feel judged. She just worked, humming her endless melodies, transforming neglect into care one small section at a time. She'd been there a month when the ranch hands came back. Caleb was at the creek, hauling water. The well had recovered from the storm but still ran shallow, when he heard the horses. 3 riders this time, including the 2 from before. They found Evelyn in the garden, bent over the bean rows with her back to them. By the time Caleb crested the rise, buckets sloshing, one of them was already talking. "Surprised you're still here, Ms. Harper. Figured you'd have worn out your welcome by now." Evelyn straightened slowly, pressing one hand to her lower back in a gesture Caleb had seen her make more often lately. "Gentlemen, can I help you with something?" "Just passing through? Thought we'd check on our old friend Caleb, make sure he's not being taken advantage of." The tall one from before grinned down at her. "Old folks can be tricky that way. Real good at making themselves seem necessary." "Is that so?" Evelyn's voice was perfectly pleasant, giving them nothing to grab onto. "It is. My grandmother was the same way, always finding little jobs to do, making herself useful so we couldn't send her to the home. Drove my mother half crazy." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Point is, there comes a time when being kind means being honest about limitations. You know what I mean?" Caleb was close enough now to see Evelyn's jaw tighten, though her expression remained calm. "I'm afraid I don't." "I mean, you're what, 70, 75? How much good can you really do up here? How long before Caleb's taking care of you instead of the other way around?" "That's enough." Caleb's voice cut across the yard, hard as the mountains around them. All 3 riders turned to look at him. "You've said your piece. Now move along. We're just concerned, Ridge, that's all." But the grin was back, sharp and mean. "Man's got a right to know when he's being played." "Nobody's playing anybody." Caleb set the buckets down with deliberate care, keeping his hands visible and his voice level. "Evelyn works harder in a day than the 3 of you do in a week. She earns her keep and then some. What she doesn't do is ride around bothering people who've made it clear they want to be left alone." The 3rd rider, who hadn't spoken before, snorted. "Touchy about the old woman, aren't you?" "I'm touchy about people who measure worth in years instead of character. Now get off my land." For a moment, the tension pulled taut enough to snap. The riders exchanged glances, calculating whether this was worth pushing. Then the tall one shrugged, gathering his reins. "Suit yourself. But don't say we didn't warn you when she breaks a hip hauling your water or falls off that ladder of yours. Old bones don't heal like young ones." They rode off at a leisurely pace, making it clear they were leaving by choice, not because they'd been driven off. Caleb watched them go, his heart hammering, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. When he finally turned back to the garden, Evelyn was kneeling again, back to her work as if nothing had happened. But her hands were shaking worse than usual, and she wasn't humming. "Evelyn?" "The beans are coming in nicely," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We'll have enough to can for winter if the weather holds." He stood there, caught between the urge to comfort her and the knowledge that drawing attention to the insults would only make it worse. Finally, he picked up the buckets and headed for the cabin, giving her the space to compose herself in private. That night, she barely touched her supper, climbed the ladder early, moving even more carefully than usual. Caleb lay awake listening to the silence above him and thought about broken hips and falling and all the ways the world found to remind you that time was undefeated. But he also thought about the garden thriving under her care, about the cabin that finally felt like more than a shelter, about the way she'd stood in that garden, dignity intact, refusing to give those men the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. The next morning, he was up before her for the first time since she'd arrived. Had coffee ready when she climbed down from the loft, moving stiff and slow. "Thought I'd get a head start today," he said, handing her a cup. She took it, studying his face with those sharp eyes that saw too much. "You don't need to prove anything to those boys, Caleb." "I'm not. I'm proving something to myself." He took a breath, choosing his words with the same care she brought to her cooking. "Those men yesterday, they said things that weren't true, but they said one thing that was, you do work hard, maybe too hard, and I've been letting you because it was easier than admitting I needed the help. We had an agreement." "We did, and I'm not changing it, but I'm asking," he paused, wrestling with the words, "I'm asking you to let me help more. Not because you can't handle it, but because you shouldn't have to handle it alone. That's what this is supposed to be. A partnership." Something shifted in her expression, softening the hard dignity she'd worn since yesterday. "A partnership. If that's agreeable to you." She was quiet for a long moment, looking down into her coffee. When she spoke, her voice was rough with something that might have been tears she wouldn't shed. "When Bill Carver let me go, he said I was dead weight. Said I was slowing down the kitchen, making mistakes, getting in the way. Maybe he was right about some of it. I am slower than I was. My hands do shake. I do get tired more easily. Evelyn, let me finish." She looked up at him. "For 32 years, I cooked for that ranch. 32 years of early mornings and late nights, of feeding crews who barely noticed the food, of making something from nothing when supplies ran short, and at the end of it, I was dead weight, easily replaced by a younger woman who could move faster, work longer." Caleb felt something hot and angry burn in his chest, but he stayed quiet, letting her talk. "Coming here, I told myself it was just for survival, just until I figured out what came next. But then you let me work the way I know how, at the pace I can manage, and you never once made me feel like I was too slow or too old or too much trouble." Her eyes met his, bright and fierce. "That's not nothing, Caleb. That's everything. So yes, I'll accept your help, I'll accept your partnership, and I'll try not to work myself into the ground trying to prove I deserve to be here." "You don't have to prove anything." "Old habits." She smiled, but it was watery. 67 years of proving my worth, it's hard to just stop. Then we'll practice it together, like hope." He drained his coffee, set the cup down. "Starting today, I'll handle the water haul. You focus on the garden and the cooking. We'll split the other chores down the middle, and if either of us is too tired or too sore, we say so. No martyrs allowed." She laughed at that, a sound he realized he didn't hear often enough. "No martyrs allowed. I like that." They shook on it, her weathered hand small in his calloused one, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for longer than he could remember. Not quite peace. He wasn't sure he'd recognize peace if it knocked on his door, but something close to it, something like belonging. The partnership changed things in small ways that accumulated into something larger. Caleb found himself talking more, explaining why he did things the way he did, asking Evelyn's opinion on decisions he'd always made alone. She had a practical wisdom born of decades watching ranch operations, and her insights often saved him time or trouble he would have otherwise wasted. In turn, she began asking for his help more freely, not just with heavy lifting, but with planning, with thinking through problems, with making decisions about how to use their limited resources. They became a team in ways that felt natural, inevitable, like they'd been moving toward this arrangement all along. The garden flourished, the cabin grew more comfortable, and slowly, carefully, Caleb began to remember what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. But the world wasn't done testing them. The trouble started in the 3rd month, when Evelyn took a bad fall. It happened on an ordinary morning. She was carrying a basket of laundry to hang on the line Caleb had strung between 2 pines, moving at her usual careful pace. But her foot caught on a root she'd stepped over 100 times before, and she went down hard, the basket flying, clean clothes scattering across the dirt. Caleb heard her cry out and was running before he'd fully registered the sound. He found her on the ground, breathing hard, her face pale with pain. "Don't move," he said, dropping to his knees beside her. "Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere." She tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a gasp. "Mostly my pride." "Can you wiggle your toes, move your fingers?" She did both, wincing. "Nothing broken, I don't think. Just bruised to hell and back." He helped her sit up slowly, checking for obvious injuries. Her hands were scraped raw where she'd tried to catch herself, and he could already see bruising starting to form on her arms. But she was right. Nothing seemed broken. "Can you stand?" "Give me a minute." She sat there, breathing carefully, getting her bearings. When she finally nodded, Caleb helped her to her feet, taking most of her weight as she tested her legs. She could stand, but barely, and the walk back to the cabin was slow and painful. He settled her in the chair, his chair, the only one, and brought water and cloths to clean her scraped palms. She sat quiet while he worked, her face tight with pain she was trying not to show. "This is exactly what those ranch hands said would happen," she said finally, her voice bitter. "Old woman, old bones, inevitable fall. They don't get to be right about you." Caleb finished wrapping her hands, gentle as he could manage. "This could have happened to anyone. Hell, I've taken worse falls than this just being careless. But it didn't happen to anyone. It happened to me because I'm old and slow and my body doesn't work the way it used to." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "Because they were right. I am dead weight." "Stop." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. "Stop giving those men power over how you see yourself. You fell. It happens. You're hurt, and you'll heal, and tomorrow we'll be more careful. That's all this is." "You don't understand. I understand that for 3 months you've been teaching me the difference between surviving and living, that you've made this place feel like a home instead of a prison, that you work harder in a day than most people work in a week, and you do it without complaint or expectation of praise." He met her eyes, willing her to hear him. "One fall doesn't erase all that. One moment of bad luck doesn't make you worthless. And anyone who says different is selling something you don't need to buy." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, blinking hard. "You're getting awful wordy in your old age. Blame the company I keep." He stood, moved to the stove. "You're staying off that leg for the rest of the day. I'll handle supper." "Caleb, no martyrs allowed. Remember?" She subsided with a small smile, settling back in the chair. "No martyrs allowed?" He made beans and cornbread the way she'd taught him, though his version came out heavier and less flavorful than hers ever did. But it was edible, and when he handed her a plate, she ate it without complaint. That night, climbing the ladder to the loft was an ordeal. Caleb stood at the bottom, ready to catch her if she slipped, his heart in his throat the whole way up. When she finally made it and called down that she was settled, he released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He lay awake for hours, listening to her move restlessly above him, hearing the small sounds of pain she tried to muffle. And he thought about age and fragility and all the ways time diminished what it couldn't break outright. But he also thought about resilience, about the fact that Evelyn had fallen hard enough to frighten them both, and she'd still climbed that ladder rather than ask him to sleep in the loft so she could take the cot. About the fact that she'd gotten up at all, had walked back to the cabin on legs that must have screamed with every step, had sat and let him tend her wounds without breaking down. That wasn't weakness. That was strength of a kind those ranch hands would never understand. The next morning, she was up before him again, moving stiff and slow but moving nonetheless. She had coffee ready and was examining the contents of the larder when he came fully awake. "You should still be resting," he said. "I've rested enough. We're low on flour, and if we're going to can those beans like I planned, we'll need more jars." She turned to face him, and he saw the bruises blooming purple across her cheek, the stiffness in her movements, but her eyes were clear, determined. "I was thinking we could make a trip to town, pick up supplies, maybe see what news there is." Caleb hadn't been to town in almost 6 months. The thought of it made something tighten in his chest. All those people, all those eyes, all those questions. But Evelyn needed things, and more than that, she needed to prove to herself that she could keep going. "Town it is," he said, "but we're taking it slow, and you're riding the mule. No arguments." "No arguments," she agreed, and he saw the relief in her face that she wouldn't have to walk the 11 miles there and back. They set out mid-morning, Caleb walking beside the mule while Evelyn rode, the path winding down from the high valley through stands of pine and aspen. The weather was cooler now, September beginning to assert itself, and the aspens were just starting to turn gold at their edges. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is," Evelyn said softly, looking around at the mountains rising on all sides. "Living up in the valley, you get used to the view. But coming down like this, seeing it all spread out, it reminds you why you stay." Caleb looked at the familiar landscape with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way she did. The harsh beauty of stone and sky, the determined green of trees that had learned to survive at altitude, the vast sweep of wilderness that made human concerns seem small and temporary. "I came here to hide," he said, surprising himself. 17 years ago, I was running from something I couldn't face, and these mountains seemed like the kind of place a man could disappear." "Did you? Disappear, I mean." "For a while. But turns out you can't hide from yourself, no matter how remote the location." He glanced up at her. "Mostly I just got good at being alone." "And now?" "Now I'm trying to remember how to be something else." He adjusted the mule's lead, giving himself something to do with his hands. "You make that easier." "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't running when I came to you. I was just running out of options, out of time, out of places that would have me. I thought I was coming to survive. Turns out, I was coming to live. Funny how that works." They reached town just after noon, and Caleb immediately regretted the decision to come. The main street was busy with people, and he could feel their eyes on him. The hermit from the mountains, rarely seen, always talked about. But worse than their eyes on him were their eyes on Evelyn, sitting astride the mule with visible bruises and bandaged hands. The whispers started before they'd even dismounted. They made their way to the general store, Caleb helping Evelyn down with exaggerated care, hyper-aware of the attention they were drawing. Inside, the proprietor, a thin woman named Judith Marsh, looked up from her ledger and immediately focused on Evelyn's injuries. "Mrs. Harper, what happened to you?" "I took a fall," Evelyn said calmly, moving toward the flower. "Careless of me. I'm fine." "A fall." Judith's eyes cut to Caleb, and he saw the calculation there, the suspicion forming. "Up at Mr. Ridge's place?" "That's right. Caught my foot on a root. My own fault entirely." But Judith wasn't looking at Evelyn anymore. She was looking at Caleb with an expression he recognized from a lifetime ago. The look people got when they thought they'd spotted abuse when they were deciding whether to intervene or mind their own business. "Mr. Ridge," she said carefully, "I hope you're taking good care of Mrs. Harper. She's not as young as she used to be." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt heat rise to his face, anger and humiliation warring in his chest. "I fell," Evelyn repeated, her voice sharper now. "Caleb has been nothing but kind and respectful. If you're suggesting otherwise, Mrs. Marsh, I'd appreciate you saying it plainly so I can correct your misunderstanding." Judith had the grace to look embarrassed. "I wasn't suggesting anything, just concerned is all. We heard you were working up there, and some folks have worried." "Worried what? That I might actually be useful to someone? That someone might value my work and treat me with dignity?" Evelyn's eyes flashed. "I've been dismissed, underestimated, and discarded more times than I can count. What I haven't been is mistreated. Caleb Ridge is a good man, and I'll thank the gossips of this town to remember that before they spread lies." The store had gone quiet, other customers pausing their browsing to listen. Caleb wanted to disappear through the floorboards, but Evelyn wasn't done. "I'm 67 years old, not 67 years stupid. If I were being mistreated, I'd have walked out the same way I walked in, on my own 2 feet and by my own choice. Instead, I'm here buying flour to make bread and jars to preserve food, because I have work to do and a home to maintain. If that offends your sensibilities or doesn't fit your narrative, that's your problem, not mine." She turned back to her shopping, her shoulders rigid with anger, leaving Judith and the rest of the store to process the speech. Caleb stood frozen, unsure what to do or say. Finally, Judith cleared her throat. "We'll need to total up your purchases." They finished their shopping in heavy silence, loaded the supplies onto the mule, and headed back up the mountain without speaking. It wasn't until they were well clear of town that Evelyn finally broke the quiet. "I'm sorry. she said. "I shouldn't have made a scene." "You didn't make a scene. You defended yourself. There's a difference." Caleb walked in silence for a few steps. "And you defended me. No one's done that in... hell, I can't remember when. You deserve defending, and I meant what I said. You're a good man, Caleb Ridge." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just kept walking, leading the mule up the familiar trail while the sun tracked west and Evelyn swayed gently in the saddle, humming one of her endless melodies. When they reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold, Caleb helped her down and saw the exhaustion in every line of her body. The trip had cost her more than she'd admit, but she'd made it. They both had. That night, after a simple supper neither of them had much appetite for, after Evelyn had climbed the ladder with gritted determination and called down that she was settled, Caleb lay in his cot and thought about the day. About Judith Marsh's suspicious eyes and the whispers that would spread through town. About Evelyn's fierce defense and the bruises that told a story of time's inevitable victory. About the fact that no matter how carefully they built this partnership, the world would always find ways to question it, to diminish it, to suggest that two people existing outside normal expectations must be doing something wrong. But he also thought about the way Evelyn had stood her ground in that store, refusing to be diminished. About the supplies they'd hauled up the mountain together. About the fact that when she'd spoken of home, she'd meant this cabin, this valley, this life they were building together. The world could whisper all it wanted. Here, in this remote place where the silence had once threatened to consume him, Caleb was learning that there were different kinds of strength, different measures of worth, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone care for you, and care for them in return, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. Above him, Evelyn's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Outside, the night birds were calling, and Caleb Ridge, who had spent 17 years learning to be alone, closed his eyes and practiced something that felt suspiciously like hope. October came to the mountains with a dryness that made Caleb uneasy. The rain that had blessed them in August seemed like a distant memory now, and the aspens that had turned brilliant gold were shedding their leaves in brittle cascades that crunched underfoot like broken glass. Every morning he checked the sky, looking for clouds that never came, feeling the air grow drier with each passing day. "Feels wrong," he said one morning, standing in the doorway with his coffee, watching the sun rise pale and hot over the eastern ridge. Evelyn joined him, her hands steadier now than they'd been weeks ago, her bruises faded to yellow shadows. "What does?" "This weather. Too dry, too warm. October should have snow by now, or at least frost." He gestured toward the forest surrounding them. "Everything's tinder. One spark and the whole valley could go up." "You think there'll be fire?" "I think nature doesn't care what we think. It does what it wants when it wants." He drained his coffee, set the cup down harder than necessary. "But yeah, I think there'll be fire." They spent that day preparing in the small ways available to them, clearing brush from around the cabin, soaking burlap sacks they could use to beat out flames, filling every container they had with water from the creek. It felt inadequate, like trying to hold back the ocean with a teacup, but Caleb had learned long ago that preparation was half comfort and half illusion. Sometimes the illusion was all you had. A week later, the smell of smoke reached the valley. It came on the morning wind, faint at first, easy to mistake for someone's chimney. But by noon it was unmistakable, the acrid, threatening scent of wildfire, still distant but getting closer. Caleb stood on the ridge above the cabin and looked west, where a haze was beginning to obscure the far peaks. "How far?" Evelyn asked, climbing up to join him despite the steepness of the trail. 10 miles, maybe 12. Hard to say with the wind shifting. He studied the smoke, trying to calculate speed and direction with information that changed by the minute. Could go around us. Could come straight through, no way to know. What do? We wait, we watch, and if it gets close, we run. He looked down at her, seeing the worry she was trying to hide. "I won't let anything happen to you." "I know." She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of trust that made his chest tighten. "But I'm more worried about you doing something heroic and stupid." "I'm not heroic." "No, but you are protective and stubborn. Dangerous combination when fire's involved." She turned back toward the cabin. Come on, if we're waiting, we might as well wait with full stomachs. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Caleb checked the smoke every hour, watching it thicken and spread, trying to convince himself it was still far enough away to not be an immediate threat. But by evening, ash was falling in their valley like gray snow, and the sun set blood-red through a sky choked with smoke. They ate supper in near silence, both of them listening to the wind, trying to read its intentions. When Evelyn climbed to the loft, Caleb almost told her to sleep downstairs instead, close to the door in case they needed to leave quickly. But she moved with such determined normalcy that he couldn't bring himself to voice his fear. He lay awake until well past midnight, every sense straining for the sound of approaching fire. When sleep finally took him, it was shallow and restless, full of dreams of smoke and burning. He woke to chaos. The valley was filled with orange light, and for one disorienting moment, Caleb thought the sun had risen in the wrong direction. Then he smelled the smoke, thick and choking, and understood. The fire had jumped the western ridge during the night and was racing down the slope toward them. Evelyn! He was on his feet, shouting, pulling on his boots. We need to move now! She appeared at the edge of the loft, already dressed, her face pale in the hellish light. How close? Too close. We've got maybe an hour, maybe less. He grabbed his pack, started throwing in supplies, water, food, blankets. There's a ranch 5 miles east. We can make it if we move fast. What about the animals? He'd been trying not to think about that. The chickens, the mule, the 2 goats they'd acquired a month back, leaving them felt like abandonment, but taking them would slow them dangerously. We turn them loose. Give them a chance. Caleb, it's that or they burn. Your choice. He hated the harshness in his voice, but there was no time for gentleness. The fire was a living thing now. He could hear it roaring in the distance, consuming everything in its path. Evelyn climbed down the ladder faster than was safe, nearly falling in her haste. Together they ran to the lean-to, throwing open gates and doors, driving the confused animals out into the smoky darkness. The mule bolted immediately, disappearing into the trees. The goats followed, bleeding their panic. But the chickens scattered in all directions, too stupid or too frightened to run in any meaningful way. Leave them, Caleb said, grabbing Evelyn's arm as she tried to herd them. We have to go. They started east at a pace that was too fast for safety but too slow for comfort. The trail was rough, visibility poor in the smoke-choked darkness. Caleb led with the lamp, Evelyn following close behind, both of them coughing as the air grew thicker with every step. They'd gone maybe half a mile when Evelyn stopped. Wait. We can't wait. The fire, the cabin. We left the stove burning. Caleb's stomach dropped. In their panic, they'd forgotten the most basic safety measure. A burning stove in a wooden cabin with fire approaching was a guarantee of total loss. But going back now, with the fire so close, it's too dangerous, he said. It's everything we have. Her eyes met his, pleading and determined. All your tools, the food we canned, the supplies. Caleb, we can't survive winter with nothing. She was right. He knew she was right. But the thought of her going back into danger made something fierce and protective roar to life in his chest. You keep going to the ranch. I'll go back, douse the stove, grab what I can. Absolutely not. We stay together. Evelyn, we stay together. Her voice left no room for argument. I didn't survive 67 years just to die alone on a mountain trail because you were being heroic and stupid. We go back together, we leave together. There was no time to argue. Caleb turned and started back up the trail at a run, Evelyn keeping pace despite her age, despite the smoke, despite everything. The valley was brighter now, the fire close enough that he could see individual trees torching, could feel the heat beginning to press against his face. They burst into the clearing and Caleb's heart sank. The fire had already reached the western edge, moving through the dry grass with terrible speed. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Get the water containers, he shouted, running for the cabin. Anything that'll carry liquid. Inside, he doused the stove with shaking hands, burning himself on the hot metal, not caring. He grabbed blankets, the box of tools, the precious jars of canned food they'd worked so hard to put up. Evelyn appeared with buckets, her face streaked with soot and sweat. The garden, she said. We can't. It's already gone. And it was. He could see flames licking at the fence posts, consuming the bean plants, turning months of careful work to ash. "We need to leave now." But even as he said it, the wind shifted. Flames that had been moving east suddenly curved north, cutting off their escape route. In seconds, they were surrounded on three sides, with only the creek offering any possibility of refuge. "There!" Evelyn pointed toward the water, already moving. "We can shelter in the creek bed." It was the only option left. They ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, the heat intense enough to make breathing painful. Behind them, the cabin caught. Caleb heard the whoosh as the tar paper roof ignited, but he didn't look back. Looking back would kill them. They splashed into the creek just as the fire reached the clearing's edge. The water was shallow here, barely knee-deep, but the bed itself cut deep enough to provide some shelter from the flames. They crouched in the water, soaking the blankets and draping them over their heads, making a tent of wet wool between themselves and the inferno above. The roar was deafening. Heat pressed down on them like a physical weight, and Caleb pulled Evelyn close, covering her body with his own, trying to shield her from the worst of it. She was shaking, whether from fear or cold from the water, he couldn't tell, and he felt her hands grip his shirt with desperate strength. "Don't let go," she said, her voice barely audible over the fire's rage. "Never," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The fire passed over them like a living storm. Caleb felt the blankets beginning to dry from the heat, felt his exposed skin burning despite the water's protection. Sparks fell around them, hissing as they hit the creek. Smoke filled the small space beneath their shelter, making every breath a struggle. And still they held on. Time lost meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. All Caleb knew was heat and smoke and the weight of Evelyn against him, her heart beating fast against his chest, proof that she was still alive, still fighting. He found himself making promises to the universe, the mountains, to whatever might be listening. "Keep her safe, and I'll do anything, be anything, change everything. Just keep her safe." Then, impossibly, he felt it. Cool air moving across his back, the roar diminishing. And most miraculous of all, the first fat drops of rain. He risked lifting the edge of the blanket and saw clouds rolling in from the north, heavy and dark, already unleashing the water the valley had been begging for all month. The rain came harder, turning from drops to sheets, and Caleb started laughing, a sound edged with hysteria but genuine nonetheless. "It's raining," he said, shaking Evelyn gently. "Evelyn, it's raining." She lifted her head from his chest, her face streaked with soot and tears, and looked up at the falling water. For a moment she just stared, as if unable to believe it was real. Then she started laughing too, the sound mixing with sobs, her whole body shaking with the release of terror held too long. They stayed in the creek as the rain fell, letting it wash the smoke from their lungs and the ash from their skin. Around them, the fire sputtered and died, defeated by the water it couldn't outrun. The valley steamed, smoke and rain creating a fog that obscured everything. Finally, when the rain had settled to a steady drumming and the immediate danger had passed, they climbed out of the creek. Both of them were soaked to the bone, shivering despite the lingering heat from the burnt ground. Caleb helped Evelyn up the bank, and together they turned to look at what remained. The cabin was gone. Not damaged, gone. Just a blackened foundation and the stone chimney standing alone like a grave marker. The garden was ash. The lean-to had collapsed. Everything they'd built, everything they'd worked for, reduced to carbon and memory. Evelyn made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "Well, at least we saved the blankets." It was such an absurd thing to say that Caleb felt laughter bubble up again, inappropriate and necessary. They stood in the rain, covered in soot and burns, looking at total devastation, and laughed until the laughter turned to crying and the crying back to laughter again. "We should find shelter," Caleb said finally, when he could speak without his voice breaking. "You're freezing." "So are you." "The old Mackenzie place is about 2 miles north. Been abandoned for years, but the roof was still good last time I checked." He picked up the blankets, the only thing they'd managed to save besides their lives. "Can you walk that far?" "Can you?" He looked at her, this woman who'd defended him in town, who'd turned back into danger to save a cabin that was lost anyway, who'd held on to him in the creek while the world burned around them, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she agreed. The walk to the Mackenzie place was brutal. Every step hurt, every breath burned. The rain that had saved them now made the trail treacherous, and twice Evelyn slipped, Caleb catching her before she could fall. His burn screamed with every movement, and he knew hers must too, but neither of them complained. They just walked. The cabin appeared through the rain like an answer to prayer, small, weathered, but intact. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the inside smelled of mice and abandonment, but it was dry. Caleb got Evelyn settled on the only piece of furniture, a bench built into the wall, then set about making the place habitable. There was wood stacked in the corner, dry enough to burn. He got a fire going in the stone fireplace, struggling with hands that shook from exhaustion and shock. When flames finally caught, he felt a surge of triumph that seemed outsized for such a small victory. But maybe it wasn't small. Maybe every victory against the forces that wanted to break you was worth celebrating, no matter how minor it seemed. "Caleb," Evelyn's voice was soft, tired. "Come sit down." He wanted to keep working, to keep moving, because stopping meant acknowledging everything they'd lost. But his body made the decision for him, folding onto the bench beside her with a groan he couldn't suppress. They sat in silence, watching the fire, feeling warmth slowly seep back into their frozen bodies. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion, washing the valley clean of ash and smoke and the evidence of how close they'd come to dying. "I was so afraid," Evelyn said finally. "When we were in that creek, when I could feel the heat getting worse, I was terrified. Not of dying, I've made my peace with that, but of dying before I could tell you how much this has meant to me." Caleb turned to look at her. In the firelight, her face was shadowed, ancient, beautiful in its weathered honesty. "These last 4 months," she continued, "they've been the best of my life. Not the easiest, not the most comfortable, but the best. Because for the first time since I can remember, I haven't felt like I had to prove my worth every single day. You let me just be. Just exist. Just work and rest and be useful without having to justify it." She looked at him, her eyes bright. "You gave me that, Caleb. And I needed you to know it, in case— Don't." He stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Don't talk like we almost died. We didn't. We're here, we're alive, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." "What does come next? We've lost everything." "Not everything." He gestured between them. "We've still got this. Whatever this is." She smiled, tired and genuine. "Partnership." "Partnership," he agreed, "and partnerships rebuild." "You really think we can?" He thought about the cabin reduced to ash, about the garden they'd tended so carefully, about all the small comforts they'd built that were gone now. And he thought about sitting in a creek bed with fire overhead, making promises to the universe while holding on to the one thing that mattered more than any of it. "I know we can," he said, "because we're not alone anymore. Because we've got each other, and that's more than most people ever have." Evelyn leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and he felt the weight of her trust like a gift. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside this abandoned cabin with its crooked door and mouse smell, Caleb Ridge felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years. He felt hope. Not the practiced kind Evelyn had taught him about, but the real kind. The bone-deep certainty that tomorrow might actually be better. That loss wasn't the end of the story. That two people who'd found each other against all odds might just be strong enough to survive anything the world threw at them. They stayed like that for a long time, drawing warmth from the fire and from each other, too tired to do anything but exist. Eventually, Evelyn's breathing evened out into sleep, and Caleb carefully adjusted her position so she could rest more comfortably against him. He should have been sleeping too, but his mind was racing, processing everything that had happened, everything they'd lost, everything they still had. The burns on his hands throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of how close it had been. But they'd made it. Through panic and fire and impossible odds, they'd made it. When dawn finally came, gray and rain-washed, Caleb was still awake. He'd spent the night watching the fire, feeding it occasionally, listening to Evelyn breathe, planning. She stirred as light filled the cabin, blinking awake slowly, her face creasing with pain as her injuries made themselves known. "Morning," Caleb said softly. "Morning." She sat up carefully, taking stock of herself. "How bad are your hands?" He looked down at them, seeing the angry red burns across his palms and fingers. "They'll heal." "Let me see." She took his hands in hers, examining the damage with the same clinical attention she brought to everything. "These need proper bandaging, and salve, if we can find any. There's a town 3 hours south, closer than trying to get back to our usual supply point." He met her eyes. "I'll go today, get medical supplies and food. You should stay here, rest." "I'm going with you." "Evelyn, we stay together. That's the rule now." Her tone brooked no argument. "Besides, I'm the one who knows what medical supplies we actually need. You'd come back with nothing but whiskey and hope." Despite everything, he smiled. "Whiskey and hope sounds pretty good right about now." "We'll get both, but we'll also get bandages and burn salve and food that doesn't require cooking, because I don't think either of us is up to anything complicated." She stood, testing her legs, wincing. "Help me inventory what we actually have, then we'll figure out the rest." They had the blankets, soaked and smoky, but serviceable once they dried. They had the clothes they were wearing, ruined but functional. They had each other, burned and exhausted, but alive. It wasn't much. But as Caleb had learned over the past 4 months, sometimes not much was exactly enough. The walk to town took longer than 3 hours. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest, their bodies protesting every step. But they moved together, and that made it bearable. The town was called Millerville, smaller than their usual supply point but closer, which was all that mattered today. They arrived just before noon, looking like refugees from a disaster, which Caleb supposed they were. The doctor took one look at them and ushered them into his office without asking for payment first. He was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands, and he worked in near silence, cleaning and bandaging their burns with professional efficiency. "Wildfire?" he asked, wrapping Evelyn's hands. "Came right through our valley," Caleb confirmed. "Lost everything but our lives." The doctor nodded, unsurprised. "You're the 4th set of refugees I've seen this week. Fire's been burning for days, moving fast. You're lucky to be alive." "We know," Evelyn said softly. They left the doctor's office bandaged and medicated, with instructions to change the dressings twice daily and to watch for signs of infection. Caleb paid with the last of his savings, money he'd been keeping for emergencies. This, he figured, qualified. At the general store, they bought basic supplies: food, blankets, matches, a cooking pot. The proprietor, a woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude, took one look at them and added extra items to their pile without charging. "Fire survivors get the community rate," she said when Caleb tried to protest. "Meaning free for the essentials. You'll pay me back when you're back on your feet." It was kindness they hadn't expected and didn't know how to accept. Caleb stood there, awkward and overwhelmed, until Evelyn touched his arm. "Thank you," she said to the proprietor. "We won't forget this. Just pass it on when you can. That's how we survive out here, by taking care of each other." They made their way back to the Mackenzie cabin as the sun was setting, loaded down with supplies and humbled by generosity. The walk was easier with full stomachs and properly dressed wounds, though they were both running on fumes by the time they arrived. That night, they made a proper meal, simple but hot, and ate sitting by the fire like they had so many nights before in a different cabin, in a different life. "We could stay here," Evelyn said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The Mackenzie place isn't ours, but it's abandoned. We could fix it up, make it work." Caleb had been thinking the same thing, but something in him resisted, pulled back toward the valley where his cabin had stood for 17 years. "Or we could rebuild," he said. "Go back to the valley, start over." "Start over." She tested the words. "With what?" "With what we have. With each other." He looked at her across the fire. "That valley was my home for a long time, Evelyn. I'm not ready to abandon it just because the fire tried to scare me off." She smiled, slow and understanding. "You're not ready to abandon it, or you're not ready to abandon the memories it holds?" "Both, maybe." He thought about it, trying to articulate something he'd barely admitted to himself. "I came to that valley running from failure. Spent 17 years hiding from the world, calling it peace. But then You showed up and taught me the difference. Taught me that building something matters more than hiding from what I lost. If I leave now, if I let the fire win, it feels like giving up, like saying those 17 years were wasted. They weren't wasted. They were preparing you for what comes next. And what comes next? Whatever we choose. She set down her empty bowl, her bandaged hands clumsy but determined. If you want to rebuild in the valley, we rebuild. If you want to stay here, we stay. If you want to go somewhere entirely new, we go. The only thing I know for certain is that wherever you are, that's where I need to be. The words hung into the air between them, carrying weight they both felt but neither knew quite how to name. Caleb looked at this woman who'd survived fire and loss without breaking, who'd held on to him in a creek bed while the world burned, who was offering him a future when he'd spent so long living in the past. The valley, he said finally. We rebuild in the valley. Then that's what we'll do. They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers, both of them thinking about tomorrow and the work ahead. The burns on Caleb's hands ached, and he knew Evelyn's must too. They were homeless, nearly penniless, starting over from less than nothing. But they were together. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. Outside, the night was clear for the first time in days, stars visible in their thousands. The rain had moved on, leaving the world washed clean and strangely new. Somewhere in the darkness, the valley waited, scarred and empty, but still there, still home. Tomorrow they would begin the long work of rebuilding. But tonight, Caleb let himself rest, let himself feel the exhaustion and the fear and the strange, unexpected gratitude for a life he'd almost lost and a person he'd almost never met. Evelyn dozed beside the fire, her breathing even and peaceful despite everything. And Caleb Ridge, who'd spent 17 years learning to be alone, kept watch over her in the darkness and understood finally what it meant to have something worth protecting. The fire had taken everything they'd built, but it hadn't taken this connection, this partnership, this stubborn determination to keep going despite impossible odds. And in the end, maybe that was what mattered most. Not what you lost, but what you refused to let go of. Not what broke you, but what you chose to build afterward. Caleb added another log to the fire and settled back to wait for morning. The journey back to the valley took 2 days. They moved slowly, hampered by injuries and the weight of supplies borrowed on credit and kindness. The Mackenzie cabin had served its purpose, but neither of them belonged there. Home was the valley, even if home was now just ash and a stone chimney standing sentinel over ruin. When they finally crested the ridge and looked down at what remained, Caleb felt his breath catch. In the harsh light of afternoon, the devastation was complete. Black earth stretched where green had been. The skeletal remains of trees pointed accusingly at the sky, and in the center of it all, the chimney stood alone, a monument to everything they'd lost. Evelyn's hand found his, her bandaged fingers interlacing with his own wrapped palms. Neither spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what they were witnessing. "Well," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears tracking through the soot still embedded in the lines of her face. "At least we know where to start." They made camp that first night in the open, too tired to do more than spread blankets and eat cold food from tins. Caleb lay awake staring at stars that seemed impossibly bright without the cabin's walls to block them, listening to Evelyn's breathing beside him, and tried to imagine how they'd possibly rebuild from this. The morning brought clarity born of necessity. They had no choice but to begin, so they began. The first week was spent clearing. Every day they worked from dawn until exhaustion claimed them, hauling away charred timber, sorting through ash for anything salvageable, preparing the ground for whatever would come next. Caleb's hands, still healing beneath their bandages, screamed with every task. He watched Evelyn struggle with even simple lifting, saw how she had to stop frequently to catch her breath, how her own bandaged hands made every grip uncertain and painful. On the 8th day, she collapsed. Caleb had gone to fetch water from the creek when he heard the sound, a soft cry, abruptly cut off. He dropped the buckets and ran, finding her on the ground beside the chimney, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. "I'm fine," she gasped before he could speak. "Just dizzy. I stood up too fast." But she wasn't fine. He could see it in the tremor that had returned to her hands with a vengeance. in the hollowness around her eyes, in the way she couldn't quite catch her breath, even after several minutes of rest. "That's enough," he said, helping her to their makeshift camp. "No more work today. We can't afford to stop. Winter's coming and we have nothing. We have time." He eased her down onto the blankets, his own hand shaking as he reached for the water. "And we have each other. That's what you told me, remember? When we were in that creek and I thought we were going to die, you told me not to let go. Well, I'm not letting go now, which means you rest." She started to protest, then seemed to realize he wouldn't budge. "Just for an hour." "As long as you need." He sat beside her while she dozed fitfully, watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath like a miser counts coins. The burns on her hands were healing poorly. He'd noticed the redness spreading around the edges, the way she winced when she thought he wasn't looking. His own weren't much better, but he was younger, stronger. He could push through. Evelyn didn't have that luxury anymore. When she woke, the sun was low, and Caleb had made a decision. "I'm going back to town tomorrow," he said. "We need proper supplies if we're going to do this right. Lumber, nails, tools to replace what we lost. And you need to see that doctor again." "I'm fine." "You're not, and we both know it." He kept his voice gentle but firm. "Those burns are infected, Evelyn. I can see it. You need medicine and you need rest, neither of which you'll get if you keep working yourself to death out here." "I can't rest. Every day we don't make progress is a day closer to winter, closer to—" She stopped, but he heard what she hadn't said, closer to the end of whatever time she had left. "I know." He took her bandaged hands in his, careful of the wounds. "But dying of infection or exhaustion doesn't help either of us. Let me handle the heavy work for a few days. Let yourself heal, please." The please did it. She nodded, tears she wouldn't let fall making her eyes bright. "A few days, then I'm back to work." "A few days," he agreed, knowing it was a lie they both needed to tell. The trip to town the next morning was lonely in a way Caleb hadn't anticipated. He'd gotten so used to Evelyn's presence, to the sound of her humming, to her quiet observations about the world around them. Walking the trail alone felt like going backwards, like returning to the isolation he'd spent 17 years perfecting and 4 months learning to escape. In Millerville, the doctor examined Evelyn's bandages, which Caleb had brought with him, and confirmed what Caleb had feared. "Infection set in deep," he said, shaking his head. "At her age, with burns this severe, it's going to be a hard fight. You need to keep the wounds clean, change the dressing 3 times a day, and watch for fever. If she starts running hot, you bring her to me immediately. Understand?" Caleb understood. He understood that Evelyn was fighting a battle her body might not win, that time and fire had conspired to test her in ways that would break someone half her age. He understood that he might lose her, and the thought made his chest constrict so tightly he could barely breathe. He bought medicine and supplies, spending money he didn't have on credit extended by people who barely knew him. The proprietor at the general store, the same woman who'd helped them before, added items to his order without being asked. "How's the old woman?" she asked as she tallied up his purchases. "Fighting." It was the only word that fit. "Tell her Martha Copper says to keep fighting. We need more fighters in this world, not fewer." She handed him the wrapped packages. "You come back if you need more medicine. And you tell her what I said." "I will, thank you." When he returned to the valley that evening, he found Evelyn sitting by the fire they'd built, her hands in her lap, staring at nothing. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. "Brought medicine," he said, setting down his pack. "And Martha Copper says to tell you to keep fighting." That got a small smile. "Martha always was bossy." "You know her?" "Cooked for her father's ranch 30 years ago, before I moved to Running Creek. She was just a girl then, all elbows and opinions." Evelyn watched as Caleb unpacked the medicine. "She always said I made the best pie she'd ever tasted. I should teach you the recipe." The casual way she said it, as if teaching him recipes was preparation for something, made Caleb's hands still. "You'll teach me yourself, when you're better." "Caleb, no." He looked at her, this woman who'd become essential to his existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. "No defeatist talk. The doctor said you need to fight, and I've never seen you back down from anything, so you're not starting now." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not quite acceptance, but acknowledgement. All right, no defeatist talk. He changed her bandages with hands that had learned gentleness from necessity, cleaning the wounds the way the doctor had instructed, trying not to let his face show his concern at the angry red streaks radiating from the burns. She bore it in silence, her jaw tight, her eyes focused somewhere past his shoulder. When he was done, she spoke quietly. I need to tell you something. You should rest. I need to tell you while I can still think clearly. She took a careful breath. In my pack, the one we saved, there's a book. Brown leather, about this big. She gestured with her bandaged hands. It was my mother's recipe book. Not just recipes. Notes, stories, things she wanted to remember. It's the only thing I have left of her. Caleb remembered seeing it, remembered her clutching it during their flight from the fire. I'll keep it safe. I want you to have it. When I'm gone, Evelyn, let me finish. Her voice was firm despite its weakness. When I'm gone, I want you to have it. Not because you need recipes, though some of them are worth keeping, but because it'll remind you that caring for people, feeding them, tending them, making space for them, that's not weakness. That's the strongest thing a person can do. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded. You spent 17 years alone because you thought you'd failed at caring for people, she continued. But you didn't fail, Caleb. You just loved people who weren't ready to be loved the way you loved them. There's no shame in that. How did you... I've been old for a while now. You learn to read people when you've got nothing else to do with your time. She managed a tired smile. You're not as mysterious as you think you are. Despite everything, he almost laughed. Clearly not. That night, as Evelyn slept fitfully and Caleb kept watch over the fire, he took out the leather-bound book. Inside, his mother's handwriting, neat and purposeful, filled page after page. Recipes, yes, but also observations about seasons and weather, notes about which neighbor needed extra food brought by, reminders about who was struggling and how to help without making it obvious. It wasn't a recipe book. It was a manual for caring, for paying attention, for building community one small kindness at a time. He thought about his own 17 years of isolation, about all the people he could have helped but didn't because he was too busy protecting himself from the possibility of more pain. About how Evelyn had walked into his carefully constructed loneliness and dismantled it not with force, but with steady, patient presence. She hadn't saved his cabin. She'd saved something far more important, the part of him that still believed people were worth the risk of caring. The next weeks blurred into a rhythm of care and waiting. Caleb worked on clearing and preparing the building site, but only for a few hours each day. The rest of his time he spent tending Evelyn, whose condition wavered between improving and declining with unpredictable frequency. Some days she was strong enough to sit up and talk, to offer opinions on his work, to insist on helping with small tasks despite his protests. Other days she could barely lift her head, fever burning through her with a heat that terrified him. He changed her bandages religiously, administered medicine, coaxed her to eat even when she had no appetite. And in the quiet moments between crises, she talked. She told him about growing up poor in a mining town, about learning to cook from her mother who could make miracles from scraps, about the brother who'd died in the mines, and the sister who'd married a merchant and moved to San Francisco and never looked back, about her own marriage at 19 to a ranch hand who'd been kind but distant, who died of pneumonia after only 3 years, leaving her alone and pregnant. Lost the baby at 5 months, she said one evening, her voice distant with memory. Something wrong with my body, the doctor said. Couldn't carry to term. After that, I just focused on cooking. Figured if I couldn't make a family of my own, I could at least feed other people's families. Caleb listened to these stories, filing them away like precious things, understanding that she was giving him the only inheritance she had, her history, her wisdom, the accumulated weight of a life lived with intention despite its hardships. In return, he told her things he'd never spoken aloud, about the family he'd left behind in Montana, about the business he'd failed at, about the shame that had driven him into these mountains to disappear, about the 17 years he'd spent learning to be alone, and the 4 months she'd spent teaching him he didn't have to be. You didn't fail at that business, she said after one such conversation. You just learned what didn't work. That's not failure. That's education. Expensive education. All the worthwhile ones are. She shifted carefully, trying to find a comfortable position. The question isn't whether you failed. It's whether you let that failure define you, or whether you use it to build something better. Like what we're doing here? Exactly like what we're doing here. 6 weeks after the fire, on a morning when autumn was giving way to the first real cold of approaching winter, Evelyn woke clear-eyed and calm. "It's time," she said simply. Caleb's heart dropped. Time for what? To talk about what happens next. Real talk, Caleb, not the hopeful kind. He wanted to protest, to insist she was getting better, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She knew her own body better than any doctor could, and she was telling him something he didn't want to hear but needed to accept. "All right," he said, sitting beside her. "Real talk. I'm not going to see spring." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama or self-pity. "The infection's in too deep, and I'm too old to fight it off. Maybe another month if I'm lucky. Maybe less. But we could try. We've tried. And I'm grateful for every day you've given me, Caleb. Truly. But trying harder won't change what's coming." She took his hand, her grip weak but intentional. "What I need now is for you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let this break you. Don't go back to the way you were before, hiding up here from the world. You've learned how to care again, how to let people in. Don't lose that just because I'm not here to remind you. I don't know how to do this without you." "Yes, you do. You know exactly how. You just don't want to admit it yet." She smiled, and it was the smile he remembered from that first day when she'd knocked on his door asking for work. Proud, dignified, undefeated. "You finish rebuilding this cabin. Then you make it into something bigger than just a home for one lonely man. You make it a place where people are welcome, where travelers can find a meal and a warm fire, where nobody gets turned away for being too old or too slow or too used up. Evelyn, promise me." He thought about refusing, about insisting they focus on fighting, on surviving, on extending whatever time they had left. But looking at her face, seeing the peace there alongside the pain, he understood that this was what she needed. Not false hope, but the certainty that her death would mean something, would change something, would make the world even slightly better than she'd found it. "I promise," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "I'll make it a place where everyone's welcome, where people matter more than productivity, where nobody's dead weight." "Thank you." She closed her eyes, exhausted by even this small conversation. "Now tell me about the rebuilding. What have you got done?" So he told her about the foundation he'd laid, about the lumber that was being delivered next week on credit extended by Martha Copper and her husband, about his plans for a larger cabin with a real kitchen and a guest room, with windows that faced south to catch the winter light. About the garden he'd plant in spring, using her methods, growing food to share. She listened with her eyes closed, humming softly now and then in acknowledgement, and Caleb realized this was another kind of care, letting her see the future she wouldn't live to inhabit, giving her the gift of knowing her influence would outlast her body. The month that followed was both gift and agony. Evelyn's good days grew fewer, her lucid moments briefer, but in those moments she was completely present, teaching him recipes from memory, telling him stories about the people she'd fed over the years, offering observations about life and death, and the space between them that carried the weight of her 67 years. "People think getting old means getting weak," she said one afternoon when the pain had momentarily receded enough for conversation. "But it's not weakness. It's just narrowing. Your world gets smaller, your body less reliable, your time more precious. The trick is not to mourn what's narrowing, but to appreciate what remains." Caleb sat beside her, holding her hand, memorizing the texture of her skin, the pattern of her breathing, all the small details he'd taken for granted when he'd thought they had more time. "I'm not ready for you to go," he admitted. "I know, but ready or not, it's happening." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "The question is what you do after. Do you honor what we built here, or do you bury it with me?" "I honor it," I promised. "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not afraid, you know, of dying. I've lived a full life, longer than I had any right to expect, and these last months with you, they've been a gift. The fire took the cabin, but it gave me clarity about what matters, about who matters. You matter, Caleb said fiercely. You matter so much that I don't know how to imagine tomorrow without you in it. You'll learn, the same way you learned everything else, one day at a time, one small choice at a time. She smiled, though it cost her. And you won't be alone. People will come, Caleb. Once word spreads that there's a place in these mountains where everyone's welcome, people will come. You'll feed them and house them and send them on their way better than they arrived. That's the work now. That's what I'm leaving you. That night, she slipped into unconsciousness. Her breathing grew labored, her fever spiked, and despite everything Caleb tried, cool cloths, medicine, desperate prayers to mountains that had never answered him before, she continued to fade. He held her through the darkness, murmuring all the things he should have said when she could still hear them. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for teaching me that survival isn't the same as living, that isolation isn't the same as peace, that caring for someone, even at the risk of losing them, is the only thing that makes life worth enduring. She died just before dawn, so quietly that Caleb almost missed it. One moment she was breathing, shallow and irregular, and the next she simply wasn't. No drama, no final words, just the gentle cessation of a life that had been lived with more dignity than most people managed in twice the years. Caleb sat holding her cooling hand as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink that seemed cruelly beautiful. The world didn't stop for grief, didn't pause to acknowledge that someone extraordinary had left it. It just kept turning, indifferent and eternal. He buried her on the ridge above where the cabin had stood, in a spot she'd once mentioned offered the best view of the valley. The ground was hard with approaching winter, and digging took most of the day. His hands, barely healed from the burns, split open and bled. He welcomed the pain. It gave him something to focus on besides the vast, echoing emptiness of a world without Evelyn Harper in it. When it was done, he stood over the grave and tried to think of words that would do justice to what she'd meant, what she'd done, who she'd been. But everything he thought of seemed inadequate, too small to contain the magnitude of a life lived in service to others, of a woman who'd been discarded by the world and had responded not with bitterness, but with grace. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you for everything. I'll keep my promise." The wind carried his words away into the vastness of the mountains, and Caleb turned back toward the valley where a foundation waited, where lumber would arrive next week, where a new cabin would rise from the ashes of the old, where the work Evelyn had given him would begin in earnest. That night, alone in the camp that felt impossibly empty without her presence, Caleb took out her mother's recipe book. He read through it again, seeing now what he'd missed before, that every recipe, every note, every small observation was an act of love. Not the dramatic kind celebrated in stories, but the quiet, daily kind that sustained people through ordinary hardships. Love is bread baked when someone was hungry. Love is extra stew left on a doorstep when a neighbor struggled. Love is attention paid to what people needed before they had to ask for it. Evelyn had practiced this kind of love her entire life, had perfected it into an art form so subtle that people barely noticed until it was gone. And she'd tried to teach it to him, not through lectures, but through example, through the steady accumulation of small kindnesses that transformed isolation into connection. She hadn't saved his cabin in that fire. She'd saved something far more essential, his capacity to care, to connect, to believe that opening his door to another person was worth the inevitable risk of loss. Caleb looked out at the valley, dark now except for his small fire, and made a promise to the woman who could no longer hear it. He would build that cabin. He would make it welcoming. He would feed travelers and house strangers and turn away no one for being too old, too slow, or too unwanted. He would practice the kind of love Evelyn had taught him, the daily, unglamorous kind that showed up even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when the world insisted it wasn't worth the effort. He would keep the fire that mattered, not the destructive kind that had taken everything, but the sustaining kind that warmed people and drew them together and reminded them they didn't have to face the darkness alone. It wouldn't bring her back. Nothing would. But it would honor what she'd given him, and maybe, just maybe, it would help him find meaning in a loss that felt too large to survive. Caleb Ridge closed the recipe book and stared into the fire, planning tomorrow's work, and the day after that, and all the days that would follow in a future he'd have to learn to navigate without the woman who'd taught him how to live. The mountains stood eternal around him, indifferent witnesses to human grief. But in that valley, in the darkness, a man who'd spent 17 years hiding from the world made a decision to step back into it. Not because he wanted to, but because someone he'd loved had asked him to, and honoring that request was the only way he knew to keep her alive. The lumber arrived on a Tuesday morning, hauled up the mountain trail by Martha Copper's husband and two ranch hands Caleb didn't recognize. They found him working on the foundation, his hands wrapped in fresh bandages, his face gaunt from grief and sleepless nights. "Heard about Mrs. Harper," Martha's husband said, climbing down from the wagon. He was a solid man with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working outside. "We're sorry for your loss." Caleb nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The sympathy was genuine, and that made it harder to bear somehow. "We brought the lumber and some extra supplies Martha thought you might need." He gestured to the wagon bed, which was loaded far beyond what Caleb had ordered. "She says you're not to worry about payment until you're back on your feet." "That's too much. That's what community does." The man extended his hand. "Name's Robert Copper, and these are my nephews, James and Thomas. They've got the rest of the week free if you need help with the building." Caleb looked at the three men, at the wagon full of supplies, at the kindness being offered without expectation of return. 6 months ago, he would have refused it all, would have insisted on doing everything alone because accepting help meant owing people, meant connection, meant risk. But Evelyn's voice echoed in his mind, "You won't be alone. People will come." "I'd appreciate the help," he said, shaking Robert's hand. "Thank you." They worked together through that week, raising walls and setting rafters. The labor made easier by multiple hands, and the companionship Caleb had forgotten could exist without obligation. Robert worked with the quiet competence of long experience, offering suggestions when asked but never pushing. His nephews were younger, stronger, and treated Caleb with a respect that surprised him. "You're the man who saved Mrs. Harper from the fire," Thomas said during a water break on the third day. "People talk about it in town, how you both fought to protect this place." "We didn't save much," Caleb said, looking around at the blackened landscape. "You saved each other. That's more than most people manage." Thomas took a long drink. "My grandmother knew Mrs. Harper, said she was the finest cook in 3 counties and the kindest woman she'd ever met. Said the world was worse without her in it." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Your grandmother's right." By week's end, the cabin had taken shape, larger than before, with proper framing and a roof that wouldn't leak. The walls still needed chinkling, and the inside was bare, but it was shelter. It was progress. It was proof that something could be built from ashes. Robert and his nephews left on Saturday morning, refusing payment beyond a promise that Caleb would help someone else when he was able. Caleb stood watching them go, feeling the weight of that promise settle alongside all the others he'd made to a woman who could no longer witness him keeping them. Winter arrived in earnest the following week, bringing snow that covered the burned landscape like forgiveness, softening the harsh evidence of destruction. Caleb worked through it, finishing the interior of the cabin in stages, building furniture from salvaged wood, creating a space that was functional if not yet comfortable. He slept in the new cabin for the first time in mid-December, and the silence was overwhelming. For months he'd shared space with Evelyn, first in the old cabin, then in the Mackenzie place, finally in their makeshift camp. He'd grown accustomed to her breathing, her small movements in the night, her morning humming. Now there was nothing, just wind and the settling of new wood and an emptiness that pressed against him like a physical weight. He lay awake until dawn, then rose and made coffee using the method Evelyn had taught him. The routine helped. Having tasks helped. He could survive this the same way he'd survived everything else, one day at a time, one small action at a time. But survival wasn't living. Evelyn had taught him that too. On Christmas morning, Caleb woke to find fresh snow covering everything. He made breakfast, eggs and bread, simple but prepared with the care Evelyn had modeled, and ate alone at the table he'd built. Then he took out her mother's recipe book and began to read. Not recipes this time, but the notes in the margins. observations about people, about community, about all the small ways someone could matter in the world. He read until the words blurred, until grief gave way to something else. Not acceptance, he wasn't ready for that, but understanding. Evelyn hadn't just taught him to cook or garden or open his door to another person. She'd taught him that a life measured solely by personal survival was a life only half lived. That meaning came from connection, from service, from the daily choice to make the world slightly better than you found it. That afternoon, he began preparations for what the cabin would become. He built a second table, longer than the first, designed to seat 6 people comfortably. He constructed bunks in the room he'd intended as storage, simple but sturdy. He made shelves in the kitchen, more than one person would need, anticipating the supplies required to feed travelers. And he carved words into the beam above the door, working carefully with tools that still hurt his healing hands. When he finished, the beam read, "All are welcome here." It was presumptuous, perhaps. He had no visitors, no reason to believe anyone would come. But the words felt like a promise made real, like taking Evelyn's vision and giving it form in wood and language. The first traveler arrived in late January. Caleb was outside splitting wood when he heard the horse. He looked up to see a young woman riding slowly into the clearing, her face pinched with cold, her clothes inadequate for mountain winter. She pulled up short when she saw him, uncertainty crossing her features. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I saw the smoke from your chimney. I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might have food to spare. I can pay." Caleb set down the axe, wiping his hands on his jeans. 6 months ago, he would have sent her away with directions to the nearest town. But that was before Evelyn, before he'd learned that turning people away was the easiest choice and the emptiest one. "You don't need to pay," he said. "Come inside and warm up. I'll make coffee." She hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of accepting help from a stranger. But cold and hunger won out over caution, and she dismounted carefully, stiff from hours in the saddle. Inside, she looked around at the cabin with visible surprise. "This is nice. Better than I expected from a mountain camp." "It's new. Just finished it this winter." Caleb poured coffee, handed her the cup. "You traveling far?" "To Millerville. My brother lives there. He's expecting me, but the pass was harder than I thought. I wasn't prepared." She wrapped her hands around the cup, seeking its warmth. "I'm Sarah Brennan." "Caleb Ridge." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, then Caleb stood. "You hungry? I've got stew from yesterday." "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." He moved to the stove, ladling stew into a bowl. "That's what this place is for. Food and rest for travelers. No charge, no obligation." Sarah ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, and Caleb found himself studying her, young, maybe 25, with the kind of weariness that spoke of hard circumstances rather than hard travel. When she finished, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I've been on the road for 3 weeks, and most people—" She trailed off, but he understood. Most people had turned her away, or charged her more than she could afford, or made help conditional on things she wasn't willing to give. "You're welcome to stay the night if you need," he offered. "There's a bunk in the back room. You'd be safe." She studied his face for a long moment, making calculations he couldn't begin to guess at. Finally, she nodded. "If it's not too much trouble." "No trouble." Sarah stayed that night and left the next morning, rested and fed. With supplies, Caleb pressed on her despite her protests. As he watched her ride away, he felt something shift in his chest, a lightness he hadn't experienced since before the fire. He'd kept his promise. He'd welcomed someone who needed welcoming, fed someone who needed feeding, sent them on their way better than they'd arrived. Evelyn would have approved. Word spread the way word does in remote places, slowly but surely, carried by travelers and traders, and the people who moved between the isolated communities of the mountains. The hermit in the high valley had a cabin now, a real cabin, and he'd open his door to anyone who knocked. There was food if you needed it, shelter if you were caught by weather, help without questions or judgment. People came. A ranch hand who'd been injured and couldn't work came for a week while his broken arm healed. An elderly couple traveling to visit their daughter stopped for 2 nights when the wife took ill. A family of 4, burned out by the same fire that had taken Caleb's cabin, stayed for nearly a month while the father found work in Millerville. Caleb fed them all. He gave them beds and warmth and the dignity of being treated like people rather than problems. And slowly, the cabin that had been built for one became a home for anyone who needed it. He learned their stories. The ranch hand had been let go for being too slow after his injury. The elderly couple had been traveling for weeks, turned away from multiple places because the wife's illness made her a liability. The burned-out family had been called charity cases so many times they'd almost started believing it. To each of them, Caleb offered something simple and radical, basic human kindness without conditions attached. Spring came, and with it, new challenges. Caleb's savings were exhausted. The supplies people like Martha Copper had extended on credit were running low. He had a cabin full of people who needed food, but no clear way to provide it long term. He was contemplating this problem one morning when Martha herself arrived, driving a wagon loaded with goods. "Heard you've been running a way station up here," she said, climbing down with the brisk efficiency that characterized everything she did. "Figured you might need supplies." "Martha, I can't afford—" "Didn't ask if you could afford it. I'm making an investment." She started unloading without waiting for permission. "You're doing something important here, Caleb, giving people a place where they matter, where they're not measured by what they can produce or how fast they can move. That's worth supporting." "I don't know how to pay you back." "Keep doing what you're doing. That's payment enough." She paused, fixing him with a look that reminded him uncomfortably of Evelyn. "My grandmother always said the world runs on two kinds of economy, money and care. Most people only understand the first, but the second one's more powerful if you let it be. You're building a care economy here. Let people like me invest in it." She left an hour later, refusing payment, refusing promises, just leaving supplies and walking away like it was the most natural thing in the world. After she left, the ranch hand, a young man named Pete, who'd stayed on to help with chores, looked at Caleb with something like awe. "How'd you do that?" he asked. "How'd you get someone like Martha Copper to just give you all that?" Caleb thought about Evelyn, about the recipe book, about everything he'd learned in their brief time together. "I didn't do anything. She's just investing in something she believes in." He looked around at the cabin, at Pete and the other people sheltering there, at the valley beginning to green with approaching summer. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the question isn't how to get people to help, but how to build something worth helping with. Summer brought more travelers and more challenges. Caleb planted a garden using Evelyn's methods, and to his surprise, it thrived. The burned soil, enriched by ash, produced vegetables in abundance. He canned what they didn't eat immediately, building stores for the coming winter. People who stayed for more than a day or two began helping without being asked. They worked the garden, repaired fences, split wood. Not because Caleb demanded it, but because being part of something, being useful in a place that valued them, seemed to matter to them. A pattern emerged. People would arrive broken or desperate or simply tired of a world that had no place for them. They would stay for a while, heal or rest or simply breathe without judgment, and then most would move on, carrying with them the memory of a place where they'd mattered, where their worth hadn't been measured by their productivity or their speed or their age. Some stayed longer. Pete remained through the summer, working alongside Caleb, learning the rhythms of the place. An older woman named Grace arrived in June, having been turned out by her family for being too expensive to keep, and never left. She took over much of the cooking, and Caleb was startled to realize how much he'd missed having someone move through the kitchen with Evelyn's kind of purposeful care. By autumn, the cabin had become something Caleb couldn't have imagined a year ago. It was no longer his cabin. It was a community space, constantly occupied, constantly evolving. There were always people at the table, always conversation, always the small sounds of human presence that made the walls feel alive. And Caleb, who had spent 17 years perfecting the art of being alone, found he didn't miss it at all. On the anniversary of Evelyn's death, he climbed to her grave with flowers from the garden she'd helped plant. The valley had recovered from the fire with the resilience of nature, green covering the scars, new growth emerging from the ash. Standing there, looking down at the cabin, larger now, with additions built by volunteers, smoke rising cheerfully from its chimney, he could almost feel her presence. "You were right," he said to the wind, to the mountains, to whatever remained of her in this place. People came. They keep coming, and every single one of them leaves this place better than they found it, just like you said they would. He told her about the travelers, about Grace and Pete, about Martha's continued support, about the way the cabin had become known throughout the region as a place where people mattered more than profit, where no one was turned away for being too old or too slow or too broken. "I'm keeping the fire," he said finally, "not the destructive kind, the one that warms, the one that draws people together, the one you taught me to tend." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, and Caleb watched it for a moment before heading back down to the cabin where people were waiting, where there was work to do, where life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. That evening, gathered around the table with Grace and Pete, and 3 travelers who'd arrived that afternoon, Caleb found himself telling stories about Evelyn, about her dignity, her kindness, her refusal to be diminished by the world's harsh judgments, about how she'd walked into his life asking for work and had given him something far more valuable, a purpose larger than survival, a reason to open his door, a vision of what a life of service could look like. "She sounds remarkable," one of the travelers said, an older man who'd introduced himself as William. "She was." Caleb looked around the table at faces he hadn't known a week ago, at people who'd found refuge here the same way he'd once found refuge in isolation. "And she'd be glad to know this place exists, to know that people like you have somewhere to go when the world tells you you're not useful anymore." "We're all useful," Grace said firmly, "just not always in the ways the world wants to measure. That's what this place remembers. That's why it matters." After dinner, as people settled into their evening routines, Pete working on a chair that needed repair, Grace mending someone's torn jacket, the travelers playing cards by lamplight, Caleb took out the leather-bound recipe book. He'd read it so many times he could recite passages from memory, but tonight he wanted the physical connection of holding something Evelyn had treasured. He opened it randomly, and his eyes fell on a note written in her mother's careful hand. "The purpose of abundance is sharing. Food kept becomes food wasted. Food given becomes food multiplied." Caleb thought about the garden producing more than they could eat, about the stores they were building for winter, about all the people who would pass through this place in the coming months and years, about how giving freely, without expectation of return, had created a kind of abundance that money couldn't buy and accounting couldn't measure. Evelyn had understood this. Her whole life had been a practice of it, cooking for people who rarely thanked her, caring for communities that eventually discarded her, maintaining her dignity and her generosity even when the world told her she had no value left to offer. And in her final months, she'd tried to pass that understanding to him, not through lectures, but through example, through the daily practice of caring, of seeing people, of making space for them without demanding they earn it. She'd saved him, Caleb realized, not from the fire that had been luck and rain, but from the slow death of isolation, from the corrosive belief that safety lay in disconnection, from the fear that had kept him hidden in these mountains for 17 years. She'd saved him by showing him another way to live, and now he was passing that gift forward, one traveler at a time, one meal at a time, one night of shelter at a time. Winter came again, and with it, the inevitable challenges. The cabin was crowded now, housing people who had nowhere else to go when the weather turned harsh. Food was tight, fuel was limited, and there were days when Caleb wondered if they'd make it through to spring. But they did. Because when supplies ran low, someone would arrive with a donation. Because travelers who'd passed through in better weather would return with goods to contribute. Because Martha Copper and others like her continued to invest in the care economy they saw being built in the High Valley. And because the people sheltering there, dismissed by the world as too old, too slow, too broken to matter, worked together with a determination born of finally having somewhere that valued them. Grace kept everyone fed with the kind of resourceful cooking that could make miracles from scraps. Pete maintained the cabin and taught carpentry to anyone interested in learning. The travelers who stayed longer contributed their own skills: mending, cleaning, chopping wood, teaching children who'd arrived with their desperate parents. It wasn't charity, it was community. And the difference, Caleb had learned, was everything. 3 years after Evelyn's death, the cabin had expanded again. What had started as a simple shelter was now a small compound, the original building, a separate bunkhouse, a proper barn for animals, gardens that produced food year-round in cold frames Grace had designed. More than 50 people had passed through in those 3 years. Some stayed days, others months. A few, like Grace and Pete, had made it their permanent home. Each one left their mark: a repaired roof, a planted tree, a story added to the collective memory of the place. And each one left knowing that they'd been somewhere that measured worth differently, that saw value in things the world outside often missed. Caleb was working in the garden one spring morning when he heard horses approaching. He looked up to find a group of riders, 5 of them, well-dressed, official-looking. The man in front dismounted with the practiced ease of someone used to authority. "Mr. Ridge, I'm Thomas Brennan from the territorial government. We've heard about what you're doing here." Caleb's stomach tightened. Official interest was rarely good news. "Just running a way station, helping travelers." "It's more than that, from what we've heard. You're housing people long-term, operating what amounts to a charitable institution. There are regulations about such things, requirements. I'm not running an institution. I'm just keeping my door open." Caleb kept his voice level, though anger was building in his chest. "People come. They stay as long as they need. They leave when they're ready. Nobody's forced to be here. Nobody's being exploited. It's just kindness." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "I'm not here to shut you down, Mr. Ridge. I'm here because my sister stayed here 3 years ago." "Sarah Brennan? You fed her, sheltered her, sent her on her way with supplies when she had nothing to offer in return." Caleb remembered. The young woman, exhausted and desperate, the first traveler to find his rebuilt cabin. "She told me what you did for her, how you treated her like a person instead of a problem." Thomas's expression softened. "Because of that kindness, she made it to Millerville. She built a life there. She's married now, happy, running a boarding house of her own based on what she learned here." "I'm glad she's well." "The point is, Mr. Ridge, that what you're doing matters. It changes people. My sister wasn't the only one. We've tracked down a dozen others who passed through here and went on to rebuild their lives, who took what they learned about kindness and dignity and spread it elsewhere." Thomas gestured to his companions. "We're not here to regulate you. We're here to help, to make what you're doing official, to provide support so you can keep doing it." Over the next hour, Thomas explained his proposal. The territorial government wanted to recognize the cabin as an official way station, which would bring both legitimacy and resources. They'd provide funding for supplies, for expansions, for whatever was needed to keep the doors open and the work continuing. In exchange, Caleb would need to keep records, submit reports, work within a system that made him deeply uncomfortable. Grace found him that evening, sitting on the ridge above the cabin where Evelyn was buried. "You thinking about refusing?" she asked, settling beside him with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen too many years. "I don't want this place to become bureaucratic, to lose what makes it work." "Which is what?" "Care without conditions, kindness without paperwork, a space where people matter more than regulations." He looked at her. "How do we keep that if we're filling out forms and submitting reports?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn told you to make this place welcoming, right? To turn no one away?" "She did." "Then the question isn't whether you want government involvement, it's whether refusing it would turn people away." She gestured toward the cabin. "Right now, you can house maybe 15 people comfortably. With their funding, you could double that. You could help twice as many people who need somewhere to be seen and valued. But at what cost?" "At the cost of some paperwork and oversight, which is a small price for doubling your ability to live out Evelyn's vision." Grace touched his arm. "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, Caleb. Take the help. Use it well. Keep the heart of this place intact while expanding its reach." She was right, and he knew it. Evelyn had never been precious about how the work got done, only that it got done. She'd have told him to take the resources, to expand the capacity to help, to worry less about purity and more about impact. He accepted Thomas's proposal the next day. Within a year, the way station had grown significantly. A new building housed 20 additional beds. The kitchen was expanded to handle larger-scale cooking. A medical room was added, staffed by a retired doctor who volunteered his time. Gardens sprawled across the valley, producing enough food to feed residents and create surplus for trade. And through it all, Caleb kept Evelyn's core principle alive. Everyone who came was treated with dignity. Everyone was given what they needed without having to prove they deserved it. Everyone left knowing they'd mattered to someone, if only briefly. The paperwork was tedious, the regulations sometimes frustrating. But Grace had been right. The cost was worth paying for the ability to help more people, to expand the circle of care, to make real the vision of a place where worth wasn't measured in productivity. 5 years after Evelyn's death, on a morning bright with autumn sun, Caleb stood in the doorway of what had become known throughout the territory as Ridge's Welcome, a name he'd never chosen but had learned to accept. The valley was alive with activity. Grace supervised kitchen work with 3 younger women who'd come as travelers and stayed as staff. Pete led a crew repairing the barn. Children played in the yard under the watchful eyes of their parents, people who'd found here what they couldn't find anywhere else: acceptance. A wagon approached on the trail, carrying what looked like a family of 5. Caleb recognized the signs: worn clothes, exhausted faces, the desperate hope of people who'd run out of other options. He walked out to meet them, already planning where they could sleep, what they'd eat, how long they might need to stay before they were ready to move forward. "Welcome," he said as the wagon pulled to a stop. "I'm Caleb Ridge. Looks like you've had a hard journey." The father, a man about Caleb's age with grief in his eyes, climbed down slowly. "We were told there might be a place for us here. We've got nothing to offer except our willingness to work, but we need—" "You don't need to explain." Caleb cut him off gently. "You need rest, food, and time. We can provide all 3. Come on inside." He helped them unload, got them settled, made sure they had what they needed. And as he worked, he felt Evelyn's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, humming one of her endless melodies, approving of what he'd built from the ashes of what they'd lost. That night, after the evening meal, when the long table was crowded with people, permanent residents and temporary travelers, young and old, healthy and healing, Caleb stood and asked for everyone's attention. "I want to tell you about someone," he began. "Her name was Evelyn Harper, and she taught me everything that matters about running this place." He told them her story, about how she had arrived asking for work when the world had decided she had no value left to offer, about her dignity, her refusal to be diminished, her quiet revolution of caring for people without measure, about how she'd died believing that this place would exist, that people would come, that kindness practiced daily could change the world in small but important ways. "She didn't live to see any of this," he said, gesturing around the crowded room, "but every person who's been helped here, every meal that's been served, every night of shelter that's been offered, it's all because she showed me that survival isn't enough, that we're meant for something more than just getting by, that opening your door to another person, even when it's risky, even when it costs you, even when the world calls you foolish, that's what makes life worth living." The room was silent when he finished, people processing his words. Then Grace stood, her glass raised. "To Evelyn Harper," she said, "who saw what we could be before we saw it ourselves." "To Evelyn," the room echoed, and Caleb felt tears streak down his face for the first time since her burial. Later, alone in his room, small and simple because he'd given the larger spaces to families who needed them more, Caleb took out the leather-bound recipe book. It was worn now, pages softened by repeated reading, but the words remained clear. He turned to the last page, where Evelyn's mother had written her final entry. It was dated 60 years earlier, made shortly before she'd died, passed down to a daughter who'd passed it to a man who'd needed its wisdom more than he'd ever known. It read, "The fire that destroys is not the only fire. There is also the fire that warms, that draws people together, that cooks food and lights the darkness. Tend that fire carefully. Feed it with care, not carelessness. Let it burn steady, not wild. And teach others to tend their own fires, so that warmth spreads far beyond your hearth." Caleb closed the book and looked out his window at the valley. Lights glowed in the windows of the various buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys into the star-filled sky. Somewhere, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, a child was being comforted. And throughout the compound, people were settling into sleep knowing they were safe, valued, and welcome. This was the fire Evelyn had taught him to tend. Not the destructive blaze that had taken everything, but the sustaining flame that gave warmth and light and hope to anyone who needed it. He'd kept his promise. He'd built something that mattered. He'd honored her memory not with monuments or speeches, but with the daily practice of caring for people the world had discarded. And tomorrow, when new travelers arrived, because they always did, he would welcome them the way he'd been taught, with open doors, hot food, and the radical message that their worth wasn't determined by their productivity or their age or their ability to serve someone else's needs. They would matter because they existed. That was enough. Caleb Ridge, who had spent 17 years hiding from the world and 5 years learning to embrace it, extinguished his lamp and lay down to sleep. Outside, the fire in the main building's hearth burned steady and warm, tended by people who'd learned its value, ready to welcome whoever the morning might bring. The mountains stood eternal around them, no longer witnesses to isolation, but to something far more powerful, the quiet daily miracle of human connection, of care given without measure, of a life lived not for survival but for service. And somewhere in the darkness, if you believed in such things, an old woman's spirit rested easy, her work finished, her legacy alive in every act of kindness practiced in the valley she'd helped transform. The fire that had once destroyed had given way to the fire that sustained, and that fire, tended carefully by those who understood its value, would burn on long after everyone who'd kindled it had turned to ash themselves, warming generations yet to come who would never know Evelyn Harper's name, but would benefit from her vision nonetheless. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything.